The surgeon's blade trembled as it pressed against cold, lifeless skin. Dr. Ambroise Paré had seen death in every imaginable form across countless battlefields. But what he was about to do in the summer of 1559 would haunt him for the rest of his life. Before him lay four severed heads, freshly delivered from the executioner's block, still warm to the touch. In the adjoining chamber, the King of France was dying in agony, and Paré needed answers that only the dead could provide. He needed to understand exactly how a single wooden splinter could destroy not just a man, but an entire empire. 11 days earlier, on a sweltering afternoon in Paris, King Henry II of France had mounted his war horse for what would become the most catastrophic 3 seconds in French history. The city was drunk on celebration. After decades of grinding, brutal war with Spain, peace had finally arrived, sealed by royal marriages that promised a new era of prosperity. The streets overflowed with wine and music. Nobles from across Europe had gathered to witness the grandest tournament France had seen in a generation. At the center of it all stood Henry, 40 years old and radiating power. He had crushed rebellions, expanded French territory, and turned his kingdom into the dominant force in European politics. But on that golden afternoon, with thousands watching from elaborately decorated stands, something went terribly, irreversibly wrong. What makes this tragedy truly chilling is that it didn't have to happen. Henry's wife, Catherine de' Medici, had begged him not to joust that day. For weeks, she'd been plagued by nightmares, so vivid she'd wake screaming. She'd collected prophecies about her husband's death for years, warnings from astrologers and mystics that all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. The king would die in single combat, struck through the head around his 40th year. The most famous prediction came from Nostradamus himself, published 4 years earlier in his book of prophecies. The words were disturbingly specific. The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds become one. Then he dies a cruel death. Catherine wasn't some superstitious fool. She was intensely intelligent, politically astute, and genuinely terrified. That morning, as Henry prepared for the tournament, she'd sent messenger after messenger pleading with him to reconsider. But Henry laughed off her concerns. He was a Christian king, a warrior who'd jousted since childhood. He wasn't about to let mystics and stargazers dictate his actions. Besides, he'd already unhorsed several opponents over the 3-day tournament. One more day of glory, one final display of royal strength, and then he'd retire from the lists forever. It was supposed to be a celebration, a victory lap. Instead, it became a death sentence. To understand why Henry refused to listen, you need to know about the 2 women who controlled his fate. Catherine, his wife of 26 years, had given him 10 children, but never possessed his heart. That belonged to Diane de Poitiers, his mistress, 20 years his senior, but still captivating at 60. When Henry rode into tournaments, he wore Diane's colors of black and white, not his wife's. A public humiliation Catherine had endured for their entire marriage. The tournament was about more than military prowess. It was about proving his vitality, his strength, his enduring devotion to the woman who wasn't his queen. Pride, arrogance, and misplaced confidence created a perfect storm of fatal decisions. The jousting field stretched along the Rue Saint Antoine, right beside the royal palace. Picture a narrow corridor 60 yards long, divided by a wooden barrier, packed with every noble in France. The crowd numbered over 1,000. Henry's children watched from the royal box, including 15-year-old Francis, the heir, and his young wife, Mary Queen of Scots. The English ambassador had a prime position to observe everything. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Henry completed several successful runs. Most courtiers assumed the tournament was ending. The king had proven his prowess. Time to celebrate. But then Henry spotted Gabriel de Montgomery in the crowd, and everything changed. Montgomery was captain of the king's Scottish Guard, 29 years old, powerfully built, and exceptionally skilled with the lance. Earlier that day, he'd nearly knocked Henry from his saddle. Nearly. The king had held on, but barely, and that near defeat rankled him. When Henry approached Montgomery for another bout, the young count actually tried to decline. He'd already proven himself. There was no need to risk another run, but Henry wouldn't hear it. This wasn't a request. It was a royal command. You don't refuse a king, especially not in front of the entire French court. As Montgomery reluctantly took his position at the opposite end of the field, Catherine de' Medici gripped her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Something about this particular matchup filled her with visceral dread. She sent one final messenger to Henry with one last desperate plea. End the tournament now. You've already won. Henry waved the messenger away. He was already lowering his golden visor into place, those protective bars that would soon become his cage. The crowd fell silent as both riders prepared. The marshal dropped his flag. Both horses exploded forward, hooves thundering, closing 60 yards in seconds. At the last possible moment, both men lowered their lances, aiming for the center of their opponent's chest. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every witness, a horror so profound that some would refuse to speak of it for the rest of their lives. Montgomery's lance struck Henry's armor dead center with a sound like a cannon blast. The wood shattered exactly as designed, but physics became cruel in that instant. The lance didn't break cleanly. The top portion continued forward with all its accumulated momentum, angling upward, driving straight into the king's golden visor. The wooden splinter, thick as a man's thumb and long as a forearm, punched through those protective bars like they were made of paper. It drove directly into Henry's right eye, penetrating deep into the socket, through the orbital bone, and into his skull. The explosive force sent dozens of smaller splinters spraying across his face and neck, piercing his cheeks, his throat, the roof of his mouth. One fragment shot up through his nose, another embedded itself dangerously close to his carotid artery. Henry's head snapped back with such violence that witnesses thought his neck had broken. He dropped his lance. His body went rigid in the saddle. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he stayed upright, held in place by his armor. Then he started to fall. Attendants caught him before he hit the ground, but blood was already streaming from his visor, pooling beneath him in the dirt. They frantically removed his helmet, and what they revealed sent gasps rippling through the crowd. The king's right eye was completely destroyed. The wooden splinter protruded obscenely from the socket, blood and clear fluid running down his face. Smaller splinters stuck out from his cheeks and forehead like a grotesque pincushion. His face was already beginning to swell into something barely recognizable. But incredibly, horrifyingly, Henry was conscious. He tried to stand. His legs buckled, but he managed to stay upright for a few seconds with support before his eyes rolled back and he collapsed. The English ambassador, watching from just yards away, later wrote that the king lay as one amazed, moving neither hand nor foot. Gabriel de Montgomery, realizing what he'd done, threw himself on his knees in the dirt, tears streaming down his face. He pulled out his sword and begged them to take his head immediately as punishment. Henry, drifting in and out of consciousness, managed to slur out words of forgiveness. They were some of the last coherent words he would ever speak. If you're captivated by these dark corners of history, where prophecy meets tragedy and medical horror, please subscribe. These are the stories that textbooks ignore, the human nightmares hidden behind royal pageantry. Your support helps keep these forgotten horrors alive. Within minutes, Henry was carried to his apartments, and the greatest physicians in Europe were summoned. Ambroise Paré arrived first, the king's own surgeon, and arguably the most skilled medical practitioner of his age. At 50 years old, Paré had revolutionized battlefield surgery, but when he saw Henry's injury, his heart sank. The main splinter was driven so deep he couldn't even see the end of it. Dozens of smaller fragments peppered the king's face, some penetrating so deeply that Paré could feel them with his finger inside Henry's mouth, working without any anesthetic. This was 1559, remember? Paré began the excruciating process of extraction. The largest fragment came out in pieces, nearly 4 inches long. Each time Paré pulled, Henry groaned in agony, despite being barely conscious. They extracted splinter after splinter from his eye socket, his cheeks, his throat. One piece, embedded in the roof of his mouth, took 20 agonizing minutes to remove, but many splinters were too deep to reach. Paré made a calculated decision. Better to leave them in than risk causing more damage by digging blindly into the king's skull. 2 days passed with Henry drifting in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he recognized people. Sometimes he spoke, though his words made little sense. Then Andreas Vesalius arrived, sent by King Philip II of Spain, the most famous anatomist in Europe. If anyone could save Henry, it was these two medical giants working together. But Vesalius took one look at the king and delivered a grim verdict. The brain was damaged. He could see the signs in the way Henry's left side was weakening, the way his remaining eye wasn't focusing properly. The lance hadn't just destroyed the right eye, it had caused massive trauma inside the skull. They needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with, which led to their horrifying experiment. They sent word to the Paris prisons, "Bring us the heads of newly executed criminals." 4 severed heads arrived that night, still warm from the executioner's block. Paré and Vesalius set them on wooden posts at the same height as a mounted rider, head, and had a knight in full armor charge at them repeatedly, trying to recreate Montgomery's strike. When they finally got the angle right and dissected the results, they made a crucial discovery. The wooden splinters lodged in the eye socket without breaking through to the brain itself. This seemed like good news, but Vesalius noticed something darker. Henry's symptoms suggested a contre-coup injury. When the lance struck, The sheer force caused Henry's brain to slam against the back of his skull, creating bleeding and swelling on the opposite side from the wound. While doctors worked on Henry's body, Catherine de' Medici worked on securing the kingdom. She understood what others didn't yet grasp. Henry was going to die, and France would be thrown into chaos. She essentially staged a soft coup while her husband still lived, restricting access to his chamber, controlling all information, and most triumphantly, barring Diane de Poitiers from seeing Henry. For 20 years, Diane had humiliated her. Now, as Henry called out for Diane in his delirium, Catherine ensured she never got past the door. It was Catherine's moment of cold, calculated revenge. July 4th arrived, and Henry had survived 4 days against expectations. Some courtiers whispered that the king might actually recover. Then the fever started. Within hours, Henry was burning up, sweating through his bedsheets, his pulse racing dangerously. Paré recognized it immediately. Infection. Those wooden splinters they couldn't remove were covered in bacteria, multiplying in the warm, moist environment of the eye socket, spreading along blood vessels. Working deeper into Henry's head, the infection reached the meninges, the protective membranes around the brain, causing them to swell inside the rigid confines of the skull. The pressure built with nowhere to go. By July 7th, the right side of Henry's face was grotesquely swollen, his eye socket weeping constant streams of pus and blood. The smell was overwhelming, that sickly sweet stench everyone recognized as death approaching. His left arm went completely limp. His face drooped. Then the seizures started, violent convulsions that left him exhausted and barely conscious. Between seizures, Henry spoke gibberish, calling out military commands from battles fought years ago, addressing people long dead. Most heartbreaking were the brief moments of lucidity when you could see in his remaining eye that he understood he was dying, trapped in a failing body. On July 10th, 1559, 11 days after that fatal joust, King Henry II of France finally died. The infection had won, the prophecies had come true, and Nostradamus's golden cage had claimed its victim exactly as foretold. Catherine de' Medici became one of the most powerful women in European history, ruling France through her sons for the next 30 years. Diane de Poitiers was stripped of her wealth and exiled, dying in obscurity. Gabriel de Montgomery, haunted by what he'd done, fled France and eventually converted to Protestantism, fighting against Catherine's forces in the religious wars that followed. He was finally captured in 1574 and executed on Catherine's orders, his head displayed on a pike as final revenge for the king he'd accidentally killed 15 years earlier. The tournament field where Henry fell was immediately destroyed, the ground consecrated as cursed. For decades afterward, Parisians refused to walk past that spot after dark, claiming they could hear the thunder of hooves and the sound of splintering wood echoing through the night. History remembers Henry II as a footnote, a king who died stupidly in a tournament. But the truth is far more haunting. He died because he refused to listen, because pride mattered more than prophecy, because 3 seconds of arrogance erased decades of achievement. The golden cage wasn't just his helmet, it was his own ego, and it killed him as surely as Montgomery's lance. What haunts you more? That the prophecies came true, exactly as predicted, or that Henry could have prevented his own horrific death if he'd just listened. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most terrifying thing in history isn't what happened, but what could have been avoided.